Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know what time is it where you are and where in the world are you listening from? Share it in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, okay? And if you enjoyed these calming, deep dives into history, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps me bring more of these long, peaceful narratives your way. Asterisk, when you imagine the fall of an empire, you might picture fire, soldiers, and banners torn down in the streets. But the collapse of the Russian Empire and the path toward the Soviet Union was slower, quieter in many ways, and deeply rooted in the daily exhaustion of its people. To understand how the Soviet Union was formed, you have to go back to the final decades of the Romanov dynasty, when the cracks in one of the world's largest empires began to spread under the weight of war, bureaucracy, and hunger. By the year 1900, the Russian Empire was a colossus. It stretched across 2 continents, from Poland in the west to Siberia and the Pacific in the east. Its territory spanned frozen tundra, deserts, farmlands, and forests, and yet, for all its size, the empire was brittle. Most of its population lived in poverty. Peasants. Nearly 80% of the people survived on tiny strips of land carved from larger estates, often sharing homes with animals to keep warm in the brutal winters. The industrial cities, such as St. Petersburg and Moscow, were growing, but factories were places of long hours, dangerous work, and meager wages. In the countryside, serfdom had only been abolished in 1861, meaning that many peasants' parents or grandparents had still been legally bound to landlords. The idea of freedom was fragile because debts and taxes kept people tethered to the soil. At the top of this immense structure sat the Tsar, Nicholas II, who inherited the throne in 1894, embodied a paradox of old world monarchy in a modernizing age. He was a family man, devoted to his wife Alexandra and their children, but he was also stubborn, insulated, and unwilling to loosen his grip on autocracy. His belief in his divine right to rule left little space for reform. While other European monarchies were adjusting to parliaments and constitutions, Nicholas clung to absolute power. This rigidity made his reign brittle in a time when flexibility was essential. The empire was also weighed down by bureaucracy. Millions of documents, permits, and decrees flowed through offices in St. Petersburg and beyond, but this sprawling machinery was slow, corrupt, and inefficient. For an ordinary person, a farmer needing land records, a factory worker caught in a dispute, or a soldier hoping for back pay, the state was not a responsive government, but a distant, unyielding wall. Corruption and incompetence spread through every layer of administration. To survive within this system, people developed habits of endurance, waiting in endless lines, bribing petty officials, or simply giving up. These habits of resignation, ironically, helped sustain the system even as it weakened. The early 20th century brought new pressures. Russia's attempt to assert itself as a modern power led to the disastrous Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The empire, which believed itself destined to dominate Asia, was humiliated by Japan, a country many Russian elites had dismissed as backward. The defeat not only damaged the army's prestige, but also revealed the inefficiency of Russia's command structure and its inability to supply troops effectively. Soldiers went hungry at the front. Railway lines broke down under the strain. News of defeats spread back home, amplifying discontent. In January 1905, frustration erupted in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Workers and their families, led by the priest Father Kapan, marched peacefully in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar. They carried religious icons and portraits of Nicholas, still believing that the Tsar was their protector and that local officials were to blame for their suffering. But soldiers fired into the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds. The image of the Tsar as the little father of his people shattered. For many, Nicholas was no longer a distant but benevolent ruler. He was now seen as the source of their suffering. The revolution of 1905 that followed was not a single event, but a wave of strikes, uprisings, and mutinies across the empire. Railway workers paralyzed transport. Sailors on the battleship Potemkin mutinied, raising a red flag at sea. Peasants looted estates, burning barns, and seizing land. To contain the unrest, Nicholas reluctantly agreed to create a parliament, the Duma. Yet, the Duma had little real power, and when it challenged the Tsar, he dissolved it. The promise of representation was largely an illusion, but the memory of 1905 lingered. The empire had survived, but the cracks were spreading. Daily life in the years after 1905 reflected this tension. Peasants faced cycles of famine, especially in years of poor harvest. In cities, factory work expanded, but with it came overcrowded housing and rising discontent. Families lived in single-room apartments, sometimes with multiple families crammed together. Sanitation was poor, and epidemics spread easily. In these suffocating conditions, workers began to form small groups, reading banned pamphlets and discussing ideas that had filtered in from Europe. Socialism, Marxism, and anarchism became what had once been the realm of intellectuals now seeped into the lives of ordinary men and women who sought answers to their daily struggles. War accelerated the empire's decline. At first, patriotism surged. Crowds cheered as soldiers marched off to war in 1914. But the war soon revealed the empire's weaknesses. Russia's army was vast, but poorly supplied. Many soldiers went to the front without rifles, told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Boots, coats, and ammunition were scarce. Meanwhile, the railway network collapsed under the weight of transporting millions of troops and supplies. Food rotted in transport, unable to reach cities, even as bread shortages worsened. Families in Petrograd, the renamed St. Petersburg, waited in long, freezing lines for bread, only to be told that none was left. Nicholas II made the fateful decision to take direct command of the army in 1915, hoping to inspire his soldiers. But his absence from the capital left the government in the hands of his wife Alexandra and her advisors, including the mystic Grigory Rasputin. Rumors of Rasputin's influence spread, damaging the monarchy's reputation further. Tales of corruption, incompetence, and scandals swirled. To ordinary Russians, the monarchy seemed not only out of touch, but corrupt and decadent at a time when soldiers died by the thousands at the front. By 1917, pressure was unbearable. Bread shortages, endless war casualties, and exhaustion pushed workers in Petrograd to strike once again. Women textile workers were among the first to walk out in February, demanding bread and peace. Their strike swelled into mass demonstrations. Soldiers sent to suppress them mutinied, joining the crowds instead. The empire's pillars, the army, the bureaucracy, and the monarchy crumbled in a matter of days. Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. For the first time, Russia stood without a Tsar. The provisional government that replaced him promised reforms, elections, and continuation of the war effort. At the same time, Soviet councils of workers and soldiers sprang up across the country, offering a rival form of authority. The old empire had collapsed, but nothing yet was firmly in its place. Russia stood between two futures, one tied to liberal reform, the other to radical revolution. The crumbling of the Russian Empire was not a sudden explosion, but a long erosion of trust, food, supplies, and stability. For years, people endured waiting in lines, working long hours, sending sons to war. But by 1917, the endurance snapped, and in its place came uncertainty and a hunger, not only for bread, but for change. Yet the question remained, in a land so vast, with millions of voices and rival visions, who would shape that change. Asterisk. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March 1917 ended more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Okay, but when an empire collapses, it does not vanish overnight. Instead, its ruins linger in broken institutions, hungry cities, and divided loyalties. Russia in 1917 was precisely such a landscape. The Tsar was gone, yet the war raged on. Okay, the old bureaucracy staggered forward, but new forces, Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, emerged to challenge it. In this strange twilight between empire and revolution, 2 governments claimed authority, and the people of Russia were pulled between them. The provisional government formed immediately after the Tsar's abdication. It was made up largely of liberals, moderates, and former members of the Duma who believed in constitutional rule. Their aim was to guide Russia toward elections and democracy, and to maintain the war effort alongside Britain and France. The man who emerged as its leader, Alexander Kerensky, was a figure of energy and oratory. He spoke with passion about freedom and progress, and for a moment, he captured the imagination of many. But eloquence alone could not feed the hungry, nor could speeches repair the shattered economy. Asterisk. At the same time, another power rose from the streets and factories. The Soviets, councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants, organized at the local level. The most influential of them, the Petrograd Soviet, became a rival to the provisional government almost immediately. Its members insisted they represented the true voice of the people, not elites in suits. Their orders often carried more weight among workers and soldiers than the decrees of the provisional government. The result was a state of dual power. 2 governments, 2 sources of authority, neither able to fully control the vast empire. This duality seeped into daily life. A worker in Petrograd might attend a meeting of the Soviet one evening and hear fiery speeches about ending the war and redistributing land. The next morning, he might pass posters from the provisional government urging sacrifice for victory against Germany. Soldiers on the front lines received conflicting instructions, obeyed the officers sent by the provisional government, or listened to the soldiers' committees loyal to the Soviets. Confusion bred disobedience, and discipline eroded. Food remained the central crisis. The February Revolution had begun with bread riots, and bread was still scarce. Farmers were reluctant to send grain to the cities, knowing that inflation would render their earnings worthless. Trains broke down, and corruption drained supplies. In Petrograd and Moscow, queues for bread stretched for hours. Women waited in the cold with children, uncertain whether loaves would run out before their turn. The provisional government promised relief, but weeks passed, then months, and still the hunger deepened. It was in this environment that Vladimir Lenin returned from exile, smuggled back into Russia with German assistance in April 1917. His arrival in Petrograd electrified the political scene. Lenin's April theses were shocking even to his fellow revolutionaries. He demanded an immediate end to the war, all power to the Soviets, and the transfer of land to the peasants. Where the provisional government hesitated, balancing promises of reform with the demands of war. Lenin spoke directly to the people's exhaustion. His language was blunt: bread, peace, land. Simple, but powerful. At first, many dismissed him as radical, even reckless, cluse. But Lenin's words spread quickly in pamphlets, meetings, and speeches. For the soldier trudging back from the front. For the worker emerging from a factory after a 12-hour shift. For the peasant weary of waiting for land reform, the message resonated. All power to the Soviets was not an abstract slogan. It was a call to shift authority away from distant elites and into the councils where their own voices were heard. The summer of 1917 tested both governments. The provisional government launched the June offensive, a desperate attempt to revive Russia's war effort. Soldiers were ordered once again into battle against the Central Powers, but morale was gone. Desertion spread like wildfire. Some units refused to move forward at all, while others advanced only to retreat in chaos. News of the offensive's collapse destroyed what little confidence remained in the government. At the same time, soldiers returning from the front carried bitterness and rifles, a dangerous combination in the streets of Petrograd. In July, mass demonstrations erupted in Petrograd. Workers and soldiers flooded the streets, demanding all power to the Soviets. Though the Bolsheviks, Lenin's faction, were not the sole organizers. They were associated with the movement, and the government cracked down on them. Leaders were arrested, and Lenin went into hiding. For a moment, it seemed as though the provisional government had regained control, but repression only deepened mistrust. Kerensky's speeches no longer inspired confidence. They sounded like delays and excuses. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants were no longer waiting for official land reform. They seized estates, divided fields, and plowed land for themselves. Barns were burned, landlords fled, and authority in rural Russia dissolved. What had begun in whispers, "Why should we wait?" turned into action. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government's authority extended little beyond Petrograd and Moscow. The countryside was following its own course. The Kornilov affair in August further destabilized the fragile balance. General Lever Kornilov attempted to march on Petrograd with the intention of restoring order through military force. Many believed he sought to impose a dictatorship. Kerensky, desperate, turned to the Soviets for help. Workers and soldiers organized to defend the city, and Kornilov's troops faltered. The attempted coup collapsed, but its effect was clear. The provisional government could not defend itself without leaning on the Soviets, and in doing so, it strengthened them. By the autumn of 1917, the question of power was sharper than ever. The provisional government lingered, but it was weak, clinging to promises it could not fulfill. The Soviets were energized increasingly, dominated by the Bolsheviks, who had rebuilt their strength after July. Lenin, still in hiding, pressed his followers to act decisively. Delay, he warned, would allow reactionary forces to regroup. The moment was now. For ordinary Russians, life remained suspended between hope and despair. They attended meetings, listened to debates, and argued in factories and barracks. Some still hoped for gradual reform, for elections that might bring stability. Others grew convinced that only a complete break, revolution, could deliver bread and peace. The empire was gone, but the shape of the future was still uncertain. And so, as the autumn chill settled over Petrograd in 1917, Russia stood at a threshold. Two powers existed side by side. One speaking of democracy and responsibility, the other of revolution and immediacy. In the factories, on the streets, and in the trenches, the question lingered when the final choice came. Which voice would the people follow? By October 1917, Russia was living in two realities at once. On paper, the provisional government still ruled from the Winter Palace, issuing decrees and speaking of elections. In practice, its words carried little weight. Factories looked not to Kerensky's ministers, but to their own committees. Soldiers listened more to their elected councils than to their officers. In villages across the empire, peasants had already seized land, ignoring official proclamations. The authority of the state had hollowed out. What remained was a shell, fragile and fading. Into this void stepped the Bolsheviks. Their growth had been steady since the spring. At first, they were only one of several socialist factions, radical but not dominant. Yet, as 1917 unfolded, their message, bread, peace, land aligned perfectly with the needs of ordinary Russians. They promised not distant reform, but immediate change. And unlike the provisional government, they seemed decisive. By September, Bolsheviks had gained majorities in key Soviets, including Petrograd and Moscow. The idea of all power to the Soviets was no longer a slogan. It was becoming a practical demand. Lenin, still in hiding, pressed relentlessly for action. He wrote letters urging his comrades not to wait for elections, not to risk losing momentum. He believed the time was ripe, that hesitation would mean failure. He returned to Petrograd, disguised and determined. His presence stiffened the resolve of the party leadership, though even then, debate raged. Should they seize power immediately? Was the risk too great? Because winter closed in and discontent deepened, the decision became unavoidable. The Bolsheviks moved with quiet precision. They did not call for a massive uprising at first, but for control of key points: railway stations, telegraph offices, bridges, and power plants. The Red Guards, armed workers, and loyal soldiers slipped into position on the night of October 24th. By morning, Petrograd was largely under Bolshevik control. The provisional government clung to the Winter Palace. Kerensky tried desperately to rally loyal forces, but few responded. He himself fled the city to seek reinforcements. Those ministers, who remained huddled in the palace as the city around them slipped away. On the evening of October 25th, the Bolsheviks made their move. The cruiser Aurora, anchored in the Neva River, fired a blank shot, the signal for the assault to begin. Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace. The ministers inside were arrested with little resistance. The drama of that night has often been exaggerated in art and memory. Epic battles, storming crowds, heroic charges. In truth, the seizure of power was remarkably bloodless. Petrograd's residents mostly stayed home, watching quietly as one government fell and another rose. For many, there was no shock, only a sense of inevitability. The provisional government had already lost authority long before its ministers were taken away. The next day, Lenin announced the new government, the Council of People's Commissars. Power now belonged, in theory, to the Soviets. Decrees followed quickly: withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land, workers' control in factories. The words were sweeping, but the reality was messy. Russia was still at war with Germany. The economy was in ruins. Hunger remained as pressing as ever. The Bolsheviks held Petrograd and Moscow, but the vast countryside and much of the army were uncertain, even hostile. The revolution had succeeded in seizing power, but holding it would be another matter. In the months that followed, the Bolsheviks scrambled to consolidate control. They moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, fearing German advance. They created the Cheka, a secret police force, to root out counter-revolutionaries. They negotiated peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk, signing a treaty that surrendered vast territories: Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, in exchange for an end to the war. Many saw it as betrayal, but for Lenin, survival mattered more than pride. Meanwhile, opposition gathered: monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and foreign powers rallied against the Bolsheviks. Russia descended into civil war: red against white, revolution against counter-revolution. What had begun as a seizure of power in Petrograd now stretched into years of bloody struggle across a continent-sized land. Yet in that moment of October 1917, before the Civil War and before the purges, a new kind of state was born. It was fragile, uncertain, and incomplete, but it marked the end of one of history's largest empires and the beginning of something unprecedented: the Soviet Union. For the ordinary Russian who had stood in breadlines, who had endured endless war, who had watched governments rise and fall in the span of months, the question was no longer whether change would come. Change had arrived. The question now was what that change would mean. Would it bring bread, peace, and land, as promised? Or would it bring new struggles, new shortages, new fears? The October Revolution ended one chapter of Russian history. But, as the years ahead would show, it was only the beginning of a far longer, harsher story. Asterix, the Russian Empire had always been a land where survival depended on food. Harsh winters, unpredictable harvests, and long distances made hunger a recurring visitor in villages and cities alike. But by the time 1917 arrived, hunger was no longer a seasonal hardship. It was a constant, gnawing presence in the lives of millions. For many Russians, the revolution did not begin with speeches about socialism or arguments about democracy. It began with bread, or rather, with the lack of it, in the winter of 1916-1917. Petrograd, the capital of the empire, renamed from St. Petersburg during the war, was a city of shortages. Its population had swelled during the war as refugees, soldiers, and workers crowded into its neighborhoods. Yet, its supplies dwindled. The war had consumed the railways, sending soldiers and ammunition to the front rather than grain to the cities. Inflation eroded wages. A ruble that once bought a loaf of bread now bought only a fraction. Families queued in the snow for hours, hoping that by the time they reached the bakery, there would still be loaves left. Bread was more than food. It was survival. For workers in the factories, bread gave the calories needed for 12-hour shifts at machines. For soldiers, bread was the difference between strength and weakness in the trenches. For mothers, it was the thin line keeping children alive through the cold. When bread failed, everything else, politics, faith, loyalty, began to crumble. The queues stretched 4 blocks, women wrapped in shawls, children clutching their hands, old men leaning on sticks, all shuffled forward, slowly, stamping their feet to keep warm. Conversations turned bitter. "The Tsar has forgotten us," some muttered. Others cursed the merchants, accusing them of hoarding flour. Rumors spread faster than facts. A train full of grain had been seized by officials, or German spies had poisoned the flour. In times of hunger, rumor fed the people more readily than bread. The government tried to regulate supplies, introducing rationing, but bureaucracy slowed everything. Permits were required, and distribution often favored the well-connected soldiers, and police received rations first, while civilians waited longer. By February 1917, resentment in the bread lines was boiling. Police patrols watched nervously as tempers flared. The spark came on International Women's Day, February 23rd, March 8th, by the modern calendar. Women textile workers in Petrograd, many of them already exhausted from endless shifts and shortages, took to the streets demanding bread. The protests began small, but it grew as other workers joined. "Bread," they shouted. It was not an abstract demand for ideology, but a visceral cry of survival. Over the next days, strikes spread through Petrograd. Factories shut down as workers poured into the streets. The demand for bread blended with calls for peace and an end to the war. Banners appeared. "Down with the Tsar. Down with the war." Soldiers were sent to disperse the crowds, but here to hunger and fatigue had eroded discipline. Many soldiers had stood in the same bread lines during leave. Their families were as hungry as the protesters. Some units fired into the crowds, but others hesitated. And soon, hesitation turned into defiance. Entire regiments mutinied, going down arms or joining the demonstrators. In a city starving for bread, the army's loyalty crumbled. That collapse was more dangerous to the monarchy than any speech or manifesto. Once the soldiers mutinied, the empire's days were numbered. The mutinies spread beyond Petrograd. In garrisons, soldiers debated whether to obey officers or join the rising tide. In naval bases, sailors discussed their own hunger and discontent. Many remembered the Potemkin Mutiny of 1905, when sailors rebelled over rotten food and poor conditions. The same grievances lingered 12 years later: maggot-ridden bread, foul meat, endless war. Hunger had not only persisted, but worsened. In the countryside, peasants too were restless. Grain requisitions for the war effort drained villages. Farmers resented sending their harvests to feed the cities while their own families went without. They hoarded what little they had or sold it in black markets where prices skyrocketed. The state called them selfish, but to the peasant, survival came first. The bread crisis revealed the fragility of the empire's logistics. Russia's railways, vast but overstretched, broke down constantly. Snow-clogged lines, locomotives failed, coal ran short. Grain rotted in warehouses or along tracks, unreachable to those waiting in cities. To a mother standing in line with her child, the explanation that railways are overloaded meant nothing. All she knew was that there was no bread at home. By early March 1917, Petrograd was in open revolt. Strikes and protests overwhelmed the city. Bread shortages had ignited a chain reaction. Hunger had led to strikes. Strikes had drawn soldiers, and soldiers had mutinied. The Tsar, still clinging to the front, issued orders to restore order by force, but his generals told him the truth: the army would no longer obey. Nicholas II abdicated days later, not because of a single battle or conspiracy, but because the state had lost its ability to feed its people. The provisional government that followed promised relief, but the hunger did not vanish. Bread remained scarce, and rationing continued. In some ways, hunger was even more political now, because expectations had been raised. People had toppled a czar. Surely they deserved bread. But when the loaves still failed to arrive, patience wore thin again. This is why bread was at the center of the Russian Revolution. It was not just a symbol, nor merely an economic issue. Bread was the foundation of survival. And in 1917, the empire's inability to provide it shattered loyalty to the old order. Workers and soldiers might tolerate speeches, propaganda, even violence, but they could not tolerate hunger indefinitely. And so, the bread lines of Petrograd became something more than queues for food. They became the waiting rooms of revolution. But if hunger toppled the Tsar, the question remained: could any government, provisional or Bolshevik, truly solve the crisis? Or would bread remain the scarce and contested prize of power? By the spring of 1917, Petrograd was no longer just a city of queues and shortages. It had become the epicenter of unrest, where hunger turned into strikes, and strikes into mutiny. Bread had begun the protests, but now the question had widened: who could govern Russia, and who could guarantee survival? The provisional government, formed after the abdication of Nicholas II, inherited a nation already fraying. Its leaders, moderates, liberals, and socialists, promised food and reform, yet they also vowed to continue the war. Single contradiction poisoned their authority from the beginning. The war devoured grain, fuel, and men. To send soldiers to the front was to drain the countryside of labor and the cities of supplies. The hunger that had broken the Tsar's rule did not vanish with the monarchy, deepened. In Petrograd, the bread lines lengthened even after the revolution. Ration cards were introduced, meant to guarantee fairness, but they often guaranteed frustration. Families queued with cards in hand, only to discover that shipments had been delayed or intercepted. Arguments broke out at bakeries. Police and soldiers tried to calm crowds, but they too often shared the same hunger. Tension was constant, a low hum beneath every interaction. Strikes became the language of protests. Workers, weary of empty promises, halted machines in factories across the city. Their demands extended beyond bread to wages, hours, and dignity. But food was always at the core. Without bread, no reform mattered. And as the strikes grew, They spilled into the streets, turning into marches, rallies, and mass assemblies for the provisional government. These strikes were a nightmare. To govern required control, but to impose order risked alienating the very workers whose support they needed. At times, officials pleaded with workers to return to their jobs for the sake of the nation. At other times, they threatened force. Yet, force was unreliable. The soldiers who might have suppressed protests were themselves wavering. The army's discipline had been eroding for months. Soldiers at the front lived on meager rations, black bread, thin soup, sometimes nothing at all. Letters from home told of wives and children standing in lines, going hungry. Many soldiers began to wonder, why fight Germans abroad when their own families starved at home? Desertions multiplied. Some units left the front altogether, returning to their villages with rifles still in hand. Others mutinied outright, refusing orders. The link between bread, morale, and loyalty was unbreakable. A starving soldier was not a reliable soldier. In Petrograd's garrisons, soldiers debated politics as much as strategy. Meetings stretched late into the night. Soldiers' committees emerged, echoing the Soviets in the factories. A team in these gatherings. Bread shortages were a constant theme. Some soldiers argued for patience, insisting the provisional government would eventually restore supplies. Others sided with radical voices, convinced that only a new order could guarantee survival. Lenin's slogan, "Peace, bread, land," circulated in pamphlets, simple enough for every hungry man to understand. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants faced their own crisis. Rations by the state continued, justified as necessary for the war. Officials arrived to take harvests, often leaving families with little to eat. Anger simmered. Some regions, peasants attacked storehouses or refused to hand over grain. Landlords found their estates raided, barns burned, and supplies seized. What had begun as isolated acts of resistance grew into waves of unrest. Villages that once obeyed reluctantly now acted decisively. The railways, already strained, made the crisis worse. Grain that was seized did not always reach cities. Trains broke down, engines failed, or lines froze under winter ice. Bureaucrats blamed shortages on weather, mechanics, or disorganization. But for those waiting in bread lines, such excuses sounded like insults. Each day of delay was another day of hunger. The Soviets gained strength in this climate. Her councils, made up of workers and soldiers, seemed more connected to the people's needs than the distant provisional government. In the Petrograd Soviet, debates raged, but one point was constant: food must come first. Decrees were issued demanding fairer distribution, urging peasants to release grain, and calling for control over factories and supply lines. Whether these orders solved shortages was another matter, but they carried weight in the streets. Workers trusted the Soviets more than ministers in fine suits. As spring turned to summer, unrest spread. Strikes in Petrograd inspired strikes in Moscow, Kiev, and other cities. Hunger was universal, uniting distant regions under a common pain. Yet, the responses varied. Some communities organized cooperatives to share what little they had. Others turned to black markets, where bread cost many times its official price. Those who could afford it ate. Those who could not waited in lines that seemed endless. The provisional government attempted to rally the nation with the June offensive, a military campaign designed to restore confidence. But instead of victories, it delivered more defeats, more casualties, and more shortages. Grain was swallowed by the army, leaving less for the cities. Soldiers at the front cursed their leaders. Workers at home cursed the government. Peasants cursed both. By July, the situation reached another breaking point. Demonstrations swept Petrograd once again. Crowds demanded bread and power for the Soviets. The government cracked down, accusing the Bolsheviks of stirring revolt. Leaders were arrested. Lenin fled into hiding, and for a moment it seemed as though authority had been restored, but the hunger remained, and hunger was stronger than any police order. The Kornilov affair in August revealed just how fragile the state truly was. General Kornilov attempted to seize power, presenting himself as the savior who would restore order. Yet, when workers and soldiers mobilized against him, his coup collapsed. The provisional government survived, but only by relying on the Soviets. Crisis that passed weakened the government further while strengthening its rivals. Through it all, bread was the silent force shaping decisions. Soldiers mutinied not for ideology, but for hunger. Workers struck not simply for politics, but for survival. Peasants seized land not out of abstract theories, but out of the need to eat. Hunger blurred the lines between political and personal, between revolution and necessity. By the autumn of 1917, the situation was untenable. Strikes and unrest had become daily realities. Soldiers returned from the front in droves, swelling the cities and bringing more mouths to feed. Peasants hoarded grain, unwilling to hand it over to a state they no longer trusted. The provisional government issued decrees, but few listened. The Soviets called for action, and many obeyed. And in the breadlines, where it had all begun, people still waited. They stamped their feet against the cold, clutched ration carts, and whispered rumors. Each empty shelf, each delay, each broken promise eroded faith in the government further. Hunger, relentless and undeniable, pushed Russia toward its next decisive moment. The question was no longer whether hunger would topple governments. It already had. The question was, who could finally feed Russia, and at what cost? Asterisk. By the autumn of 1917, Russia was a nation worn thin by waiting for years. People had queued for bread, shivering in winter, sweating in summer, clutching ration cards that too often yielded nothing. The queues had shaped their days, their moods, their very expectations of life, and yet bread was still scarce. The provisional government had promised relief, but its words had crumbled like stale crusts. The Soviets, meanwhile, promised something more radical, not just bread, but power itself in the hands of those who waited in line. Bread had become more than food. It was a symbol of legitimacy. Whoever could deliver it would rule Russia. Whoever failed would fall. In Petrograd, the bread lines were still the city's defining feature. Before dawn, people gathered at bakeries, hoping that wagons of flour would arrive. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did not. Soldiers returning from the front stood beside women and children, their uniforms ragged, their eyes hollow. They too waited, muttering about how they had fought at the front, only to return home to the same empty shelves. The lines were places of conversation, of rumor, of politics. Pamphlets circulated easily through the crowds. Bolsheviks, slogans, peace, bread, land, spread as naturally as whispered complaints. The provisional government's inability to stabilize supplies was fatal. Each military offensive meant more grain diverted to the front, and each defeat meant more soldiers abandoning their posts, bringing their hunger back to the cities. Peasants in the countryside refused to release grain to the state, fearing it would vanish into railways and never return. Instead, they hoarded or sold on the black market, where a loaf could cost weeks of wages. Officials condemned them as speculators, but to the peasants, they were simply keeping their families alive. Strikes intensified through the autumn. Workers demanded higher rations, shorter hours, and more control over production. Factories slowed or stopped. Tram workers halted lines. Coal miners left shafts. Metal workers downed tools. The cities stuttered. Without transport, without coal, without labor, the fragile supply system fractured further. Hunger fed strikes. Strikes deepened hunger. The army was no longer a reliable force. Soldiers mutinied openly, forming committees that debated orders instead of obeying them. In barracks, discussions about bread were inseparable from debates about politics. Soldiers who had stood in bread lines on leave saw no difference between their own hunger and that of the workers. Both blamed the same government, the same failures, the same war. Their rifles, once symbols of obedience, became instruments of rebellion. In September, the Bolsheviks gained majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. This was not merely a political shift in committees, it reflected the mood of the breadlines. In barracks, the Bolsheviks had one clear advantage. They tied every political question back to hunger. Where Kerensky spoke of democracy and honor, Lenin spoke of bread, and bread spoke louder. The Kornilov affair in August had already discredited the provisional government further. Its reliance on the Soviets to defeat Kornilov's attempted coup revealed just how dependent it was on forces it could not control. The image of Kerensky as a decisive leader collapsed. What remained was a government distrusted by workers, resented by soldiers, and ignored by peasants. By October, the atmosphere in Petrograd was heavy with inevitability. Factories buzzed with rumors of a coming uprising. Soldiers whispered about when, not if, the Soviets would seize power. Even the queues outside bakeries reflected this anticipation. Soon, people said, things will change. The hunger that had sparked protests in February was still there, but now it was joined by expectation that the waiting would end, that someone would finally deliver. The Bolsheviks prepared carefully. They did not plan a grand, bloody revolution, but a seizure of key points, railway stations, telegraphs, bridges, food depots. Control of these meant control of the city. Red Guards, many of them factory workers who had waited in the same bread lines, took positions quietly. Soldiers sympathetic to the Soviets manned checkpoints. On October 24th to 25th, the move began. The seizure of power in Petrograd was not the storming chaos later painted in propaganda. It was deliberate, methodical, and, to many residents, barely noticeable. Streetcars still ran, bakeries still had queues, families still stamped their feet in the cold. Yet, behind the scenes, authority was shifting. By the time the cruiser Aurora fired its blank shell as a signal, the city was already in Bolshevik hands. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, fell with little bloodshed. Its defenders, many of them cadets and Cossacks, were outnumbered and demoralized. Ministers were arrested, Kerensky fled, and by morning, the government was gone. Lenin announced the birth of Soviet power, promising peace, land, and bread. Bread, once again, was at the center of politics. The Bolsheviks issued decrees to redistribute land and to withdraw from the war. But the bread decree was the one ordinary Russians clung to. Grain would be requisitioned, distribution reorganized, rationing enforced under new authority. Whether this system would succeed was uncertain, but for those in the queues, hope returned. At last, someone had made their hunger the first priority. Yet, the reality was harsher. The war's end required negotiations, and until then, supplies still drained to the front. Peasants still resisted handing over grain. Transport remained broken. The hunger did not vanish in November, nor in December. For many, life in the Soviet state looked much like life before, waiting in lines, clutching ration cards, muttering rumors. The promises were new, but the loaves were still scarce. Still, there was a psychological shift. The Bolsheviks had tied their legitimacy to bread, and people believed, or at least hoped, that things would improve. Even when shortages continued, the memory of the provisional government's failures made many cling to the Soviets. Better to endure under those who promised bread than under those who had ignored it. In this way, the bread lines of 1917 shaped the revolution as much as any battle or speech. They were the silent battleground, the place where legitimacy was decided loaf by loaf. The October Revolution was not only about seizing palaces or writing decrees, it was about convincing the hungry that someone, finally, would feed them. And yet, the question lingered. Could even the Bolsheviks, with all their slogans and authority, truly master the vast hunger of Russia? Or would bread remain the elusive prize, forever just out of reach? Asterisk, the revolution of 1917 is often remembered for its great turning points: the abdication of the Tsar, the storming of the Winter Palace, the rise of Lenin. But beneath these iconics, moments was something quieter, slower, and, in many ways, more transformative: the emergence of the Soviets. The Soviets' councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants were not born in 1917. They had appeared earlier during the Revolution of 1905, when strikes and protests paralyzed the empire. Back then, workers in St. Petersburg had organized a council to coordinate their demands, a makeshift parliament of laborers and activists. Though the 1905 uprising failed, the idea lingered that ordinary people, not bureaucrats or aristocrats, could organize themselves, speak collectively, and shape events. By 1917, that memory had returned. When strikes and demonstrations erupted in Petrograd in February, workers once again gathered to discuss not just grievances, but action. Soldiers, many of them peasants in uniform, joined them. What began as factory meetings and regimental committees coalesced into Soviet councils that claimed to speak for workers and soldiers alike. The Petrograd Soviet quickly became the most important of them all. The very word, Soviet, means council. At first, it was a practical solution, a way to coordinate strikes, to organize food distribution, to manage the chaos of a collapsing state. But it soon became more than that. To many Russians, the Soviets represented something new, something that felt closer and more authentic than the distant provisional government. A minister in Petrograd might issue a decree, but it was the Soviet meeting in the factory floor or barracks that shaped daily life. In those meetings, the atmosphere was both chaotic and electric. Workers, who had once been silent under managers, now stood to speak. Soldiers, accustomed to obeying officers, now debated openly. A factory Soviet might meet late into the night, with men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, voices rising in argument. Some called for patience, others for radical change. Decisions were made by votes, hands raised, sometimes amid shouting. It was messy, but it was participation, and participation itself was intoxicating for many. This was the first taste of political life. Under the Tsar, politics had been distant, reserved for aristocrats and officials. Now, in the Soviets, a metal worker or a foot soldier could stand and have his voice counted. The experience reshaped how people saw themselves. They were no longer subjects of the empire, but participants in shaping a new order. The Petrograd Soviet was the most visible, but Soviets spread across the empire. In Moscow, Kiev, and smaller towns, similar councils sprang up. Even in the countryside, peasants formed their own Soviets, though theirs focused more on land and harvests than on factories or barracks. The Soviet idea, collective self-rule, was flexible enough to adapt to different settings. This created what historians call dual power. On one side stood the provisional government, speaking of law, order, and democracy. On the other side stood the Soviets, claiming to represent the people directly. The two coexisted uneasily, but their relationship was never equal. The provisional government controlled ministries and issued decrees, yet without the Soviets, it could not enforce much. Soldiers followed their committees, not their officers. Workers listened to Soviets, not managers. Authority was shifting from the official state to these new councils, two ordinary Russians. The difference was palpable. The provisional government felt distant, its promises abstract. The Soviets felt immediate. A factory lacked bread. The workers turned to their Soviet, not to a minister. If soldiers wanted to discuss orders, they held a meeting. In this way, the Soviets became not only political bodies, but survival mechanisms. The Bolsheviks, at first, were only one faction within the Soviets. In February and March, they were still small compared to the socialist revolutionaries or Mensheviks, but they understood the potential of these councils better than anyone else. Lenin's slogan, "All power to the Soviets," was more than rhetoric. It was a recognition that the Soviets were the true source of legitimacy in revolutionary Russia. Still, the Soviets were not unified. Their debates were fierce. Should they cooperate with the provisional government, supporting it until elections could be held? Or should they push for immediate revolution, transferring power entirely into Soviet hands? Early on, many Soviets leaned toward cooperation, hoping for gradual reform. But as shortages persisted and the war dragged on, frustration mounted. More and more, the voices calling for complete Soviet power grew louder. The daily operation of a Soviet reveals why they captured so much loyalty. Meetings were open to workers and soldiers. Agendas included everything from wages to rations to political resolutions. Votes were frequent. Delegates could be recalled at any time by their constituents, a sharp contrast to the provisional government, where officials often felt untouchable. In this sense, Soviets embodied a form of direct democracy that felt radical, even exhilarating, to those who had lived under autocracy. The symbolism mattered too. Soviets met not in palaces, but in factories, schools, and barracks. Their members dressed like workers and soldiers, not aristocrats. They spoke in plain language, not legal jargon. To attend a Soviet was to feel included, to feel that power was finally in the hands of the ordinary. As spring turned to summer, Soviets multiplied. In villages, peasants gathered to decide whether to seize land. In garrisons, soldiers voted on whether to obey orders. In factories, workers debated how much authority managers should have. The state, already fragile, began to dissolve into a patchwork of councils. It was governance by meeting, governance by vote, governance by exhaustion and passion. The significance of the Soviets lies not only in their politics, but in their atmosphere. Imagine a candlelit room, the air thick with smoke, benches crowded with men and women after a long day's work. Voices rise, one after another, demanding, questioning, shouting. Hands are raised, motions passed, delegates chosen. The hour grows late, but still they argue, because this is power, and for the first time, this is theirs. But this power was also unstable. The Soviets could inspire, but could they govern? Could meetings and votes replace administration and supply chains? Could councils ensure bread, coal, and fuel? This question hung in the air in 1917. Enthusiasm carried the Soviets forward, but enthusiasm alone could not move trains or feed cities, and yet, for the moment, that question was postponed. In the spring and summer of 1917, the Soviets were not yet burdened by full responsibility. They could promise much and blame the provisional government for failures. This made them popular, but it also set the stage for a reckoning. All power truly moved to the Soviets. Could they deliver more than the governments they opposed? The Soviets of 1917 were more than councils. They were laboratories of a new society. They represented possibility, the idea that ordinary people could shape history. In the breadlines, in the trenches, in the factories, this possibility felt tangible, even if its limits were unclear. But the open question remained: were the Soviets a temporary measure, born of chaos, or the foundation of a new state? Could councils created to meet immediate needs, bread, wages, peace, transform into the backbone of a nation? The spring of 1917 was a season of councils. Across Russia, the Soviets multiplied in factories, barracks, villages, and towns. Groups of men and women gathered to deliberate. What began as a handful of assemblies in Petrograd soon spread into hundreds of local bodies, each claiming to represent the will of workers, soldiers, or peasants. To many, these Soviets seemed not just political organs, but instruments of survival, places where hunger, war, and hardship could be discussed and acted upon. But as they grew in number, they also grew in complexity. No two Soviets were quite alike. In an industrial city, the council might be dominated by factory workers and radical socialists. In a rural village, the Soviet might consist mostly of peasants discussing harvests and land redistribution. In barracks, soldiers, Soviets, debated whether orders from officers should be followed. The diversity of voices gave the movement energy, but also revealed deep divisions. At the center of this web sat the Petrograd Soviet, the most powerful and influential of all. It quickly became a rival government to the provisional government. From its headquarters in the Tauride Palace, the same building where the provisional government met, the Petrograd Soviet issued orders that carried more authority among workers and soldiers than the decrees of ministers. One of its earliest actions, known as Order No. 1, instructed soldiers to obey their officers only if commands did not contradict the Soviet. With a single document, the chain of command in the army was fractured. This dual power, the coexistence of the provisional government and the Soviets, defined 1917. It was a fragile, unstable arrangement. The provisional government had legal authority, but little trust. The Soviets had popular legitimacy, but limited capacity. Together, they pulled Russia in opposite directions. In meetings of the Petrograd Soviet, debates raged. Should they cooperate with the provisional government, supporting reforms until a constituent assembly could be elected? Or should they push for immediate transfer of power, bypassing elections altogether? The majority of moderate socialists in the spring favored cooperation, believing that Russia was not ready for radical transformation. They hoped that by working alongside Kerensky and the provisional government, stability could be preserved. But others, especially the Bolsheviks, argued differently. Lenin's April theses had made their position clear. The provisional government was a facade, capable of solving the crisis. Only the Soviets, he claimed, could deliver peace, bread, and land. For weeks, this seemed extreme, yet his hunger persisted and the war dragged on. More workers and soldiers found themselves leaning toward the Bolsheviks' clarity. The daily life of the Soviets reflected both their promise and their limitations. Meetings stretched into the night. In smoky rooms filled with tired workers, voices rose in argument. Some demanded immediate control over factories. Others urged caution. In soldiers, Soviets, men debated whether to remain at the front. In peasant Soviets, discussions of land often ended in heated disputes. Decisions were made by votes, hands raised, sometimes with little regard for long-term consequences. The energy was real, but administration was weak for ordinary people. However, the Soviets felt closer than the provisional government. Ministers in suits spoke of constitutions, parliaments, and alliances. Soviet delegates spoke of bread, wages, and families. When a worker needed an advocate against a manager, he turned to a Soviet. When soldiers questioned orders, they asked their committee. When peasants sought permission to seize land, they brought it to their village Soviet. In this sense, the Soviets became more than councils. They were the faces of authority people trusted. The provisional government felt this competition acutely. Its decrees were often ignored, undermined by Soviet resolutions. Efforts to restore discipline in the army faltered because soldiers listened to Soviets, not officers. Attempts to secure grain from peasants collapsed because village Soviets opposed requisition orders. At every step, the government's weakness became more obvious. By the summer, tensions sharpened. Strikes and protests swept Petrograd in June and July. Crowds shouted all power to the Soviets, a slogan that alarmed moderates but thrilled radicals. Though the July Days uprising was suppressed, it revealed the growing influence of the Soviets as both inspiration and shield. Workers and soldiers looked to them for guidance. Even when Bolshevik leaders hesitated, the Kornilov affair in August was another turning point. General Lever Kornilov attempted to march on Petrograd, presenting himself as a savior who would restore discipline and authority. Kerensky, desperate to defend the capital, appealed to the Soviets for help. Workers armed themselves, soldiers mobilized, and Kornilov's advance collapsed. The provisional government survived only because the Soviets had saved it. But this victory came at a price. The Soviets were now stronger than ever, while the provisional government appeared helpless in factories and barracks. This strengthened the perception that the Soviets, not ministers, held the future. Bolshevik influence surged as they called for decisive action. The socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who had argued for cooperation with the provisional government, found themselves losing ground. Their cautious approach seemed out of step with the urgency of the moment. Yet, despite their rising power, the Soviets faced their own dilemmas. They were instruments of protest and participation, but could they govern a vast empire? Councils, built on debate and recall, handled the complexities of transport, finance, and diplomacy. Many in 1917 did not ask these questions, swept up instead in the exhilaration of having a voice. But the contradictions were already visible. The Petrograd Soviet, in particular, became a stage for drama. Delegates shouted, argued, applauded, and jeered. Speeches were long and passionate, filled with promises and denunciations. Resolutions passed quickly, but implementation lagged. For many, attending the Soviet was itself a form of empowerment, regardless of whether results followed. Soviets also carried a symbolic weight. They embodied a new kind of legitimacy, one based not on birth or bureaucracy, but on presence. A worker who raised his hand in a Soviet meeting felt he had as much claim to authority as any aristocrat. This sense of equality fueled loyalty. It also fueled expectations that no government could easily meet. By September, the Soviets were no longer simply councils. They had become the gravitational center of Russian politics. The provisional government lingered, issuing decrees, but few listened. The Soviets debated endlessly, but their influence grew daily. The balance of power was shifting visibly, and yet uncertainty persisted. Were the Soviets temporary bodies, born of crisis, destined to fade when stability returned? Or were they the foundation of a new state, one that could replace all others? That autumn, as Petrograd braced for the coming winter, the question remained unresolved. The provisional government still held formal power. The Soviets still held the people's trust, but the space between them was narrowing, and history was moving toward a collision. By the autumn of 1917, the Soviets had grown from local councils of workers and soldiers into the most powerful institutions in Russia. They were no longer just debating clubs or instruments of protest. They were shaping loyalties, directing strikes, and even commanding soldiers. The provisional government still occupied its offices and spoke the language of authority. But in the factories, barracks, and villages, people looked elsewhere. The Soviets had become the true voice of the revolution. The Petrograd Soviet, in particular, was the beating heart of this new power. Delegates gathered daily, their benches filled with metal workers, sailors, and soldiers in worn uniforms. Discussions stretched for hours, filled with arguments over policy, supply, and war. Speech was met with applause, jeers, or shouts, depending on who was speaking. The energy was raw, but the authority it produced was undeniable. When the Soviet passed a resolution, workers and soldiers took it seriously. Soviets, often ignoring the decrees of the provisional government entirely. This authority rested not only on politics, but on immediacy. The provisional government spoke of future elections, distant reforms, and constitutional frameworks. The Soviets spoke of bread today, peace tomorrow, land for peasants now. Their language was direct, stripped of legal jargon, and addressed to the daily struggles of ordinary people. That closeness made the Soviets the natural center of loyalty. By September, the Bolsheviks had gained majorities in key Soviets, including Petrograd and Moscow. This transformation was not sudden, but gradual, the product of months of frustration, with moderates who urged cooperation with the provisional government. Each time shortages worsened or the war dragged on, Bolshevik slogans gained credibility. Each strike, each mutiny, each failure of the government tilted support further in their direction. For Lenin, this was the moment he had awaited. He had argued since April that all power to the Soviets was not merely a slogan, but a strategy. Now, with the Soviets leaning toward his party, that strategy could become reality. He pressed his comrades to act quickly. He warned, would allow the provisional government to regroup. The Soviets had the loyalty of workers and soldiers. It must now seize full authority. The Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet became the instrument of this plan, formed to defend the city from possible counter-revolution. It quietly placed loyal units under its control. Red Guards, armed workers organized through the Soviet, drilled in factories and courtyards. Sailors from Kronstadt, long radicalized, pledged support. The infrastructure of power shifted quietly into Soviet hands. When the Bolsheviks finally moved in late October, it was under the banner of the Soviets. They claimed not to be overthrowing the provisional government for their party's sake, but on behalf of the Soviets, the councils of the people. This distinction mattered. It framed the revolution not as a coup, but as the fulfillment of the Soviets' authority. The seizure of Petrograd was swift and in many places anticlimactic. Railway stations, telegraph offices, and bridges were taken with little resistance. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, was defended by cadets and Cossacks, but soon overwhelmed. The ministers were arrested. By morning, the provisional government no longer existed. That same evening, in the Smolny Institute, headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet, Lenin addressed the assembled delegates. His words were simple. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. In practice, this meant the Soviets, now under Bolshevik leadership, had become the government of Russia. The transformation was astonishing. Less than a year earlier, Soviets had been ad hoc councils, improvising solutions to hunger and war. Now they stood as the foundation of a new state. Their resolutions carried the weight of law. Their committees directed armies. Their decrees promised land, peace, and bread. Yet the contradictions remained. Could Soviets, designed for local debate and immediate needs, govern a vast empire? Could councils of workers and soldiers manage railways, finance, and foreign diplomacy? The answer, in time, would involve compromises. The Bolsheviks would centralize authority, reducing the Soviets' independence. Meetings would grow more formal, less spontaneous. Delegates would be less easily recalled, more bound to party lines. The raw democracy of 1917 would give way to the bureaucracy of the Soviet state. But in that moment, October 1917, the Soviets were at their peak as instruments of popular power. They embodied the idea that ordinary people could seize control of history, that councils of workers and peasants could replace parliaments and monarchs. For those who had sat in breadlines, marched in strikes, or mutinied in barracks, the Soviets were proof that their struggles had meaning. In the weeks after the revolution, decrees flowed rapidly on peace, land redistribution, workers' control in factories. Each was issued in the name of the Soviets, reinforcing their claim to be the people's voice. And yet, even as the ink dried, challenges mounted. Hunger persisted. The war was not yet over. Its opposition forces rallied. Civil war loomed. The Soviets had seized power, but whether they could wield it effectively was another question. The legacy of the Soviets is complex. For some, they remain symbols of grassroots democracy, of workers and peasants asserting themselves against centuries of autocracy. For others, they became instruments of one-party control, stripped of their original vitality. Both views are true, depending on the moment in history. But in 1917, in the factories of Petrograd, the barracks of Moscow, and the villages of the countryside, the Soviets were something rare and powerful, a sense of collective voice. In their meetings, a worker or soldier could stand, speak, and vote, feeling for the first time that he was shaping the fate of a nation. And so, as the Winter Palace fell and the Soviets declared victory, Russia entered a new chapter. The councils that had begun as survival mechanisms now stood as the foundation of a revolutionary state. The empire was gone, the provisional government defeated, and the Soviets had become not just councils, but rulers. Yet the open question remained, cawing in the minds of those who had raised their hands in smoky rooms. Had they truly taken power into their own hands, or merely handed it to a new authority that spoke in their name? The Russian Revolution of 1917 was not one event, but a chain of upheavals, each feeding into the next. The February Revolution had swept away the Romanov dynasty, leaving the empire without its Tsar. A provisional government now held power in Petrograd, but it was fragile, distrusted, and hemmed in by war, shortages, and unrest. At the same time, Soviets workers and soldiers' councils had sprung up, competing for authority. Russia stood in a strange limbo. The old order had collapsed, but no new order had yet taken firm root. It was into this vacuum that Vladimir Lenin returned, bringing with him ideas that would change the revolution's course forever. Lenin had been in exile for years. Since his youth, he had been a radical, shaped by the memory of his brother's execution for plotting against the Tsar, and hardened by his own encounters with repression. By 1917, he had lived in Switzerland, Germany, and other corners of Europe, writing, arguing, and organizing among small circles of revolutionaries. He was not unknown. His pamphlets circulated underground in Russia. His name was recognized in political circles, but he was not yet the commanding figure he would become. His ideas, however, were sharp, uncompromising, and aimed at nothing less than a complete transformation of society. When news of the February Revolution reached Lenin in Zurich, he was restless. Russia had risen, the Tsar had fallen, and the provisional government was speaking of democracy. But Lenin was suspicious. To him, this was not the end of autocracy, but a halfway measure, one that would leave power in the hands of elites, landlords, and capitalists. He believed the revolution must go further, that it must place power directly in the Soviets and bring about a socialist state. The problem was distance. Lenin was far from Russia, and the war made travel difficult. Germany, at war with Russia, saw an opportunity. If Lenin and his Bolsheviks could destabilize Russia further, it might weaken the Eastern Front. And so, with German assistance, Lenin and a group of exiles were transported across Europe in a sealed train, passing through hostile territory to reach Petrograd. The journey itself became legend, the image of revolutionaries in a closed carriage, carrying with them not weapons, but ideas. When Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917, he was greeted by crowds of supporters. Soldiers, workers, and Bolsheviks gathered to welcome him. To many, he seemed almost otherworldly, a man returning from exile with answers at a time when answers were scarce. At his first speech shocked even his comrades. That speech, and The documents that followed became known as the April Theses. In them, Lenin set out a vision radically different from the cautious optimism of moderates. He called for an immediate end to the war, which he denounced as an imperialist conflict fought for the interests of the wealthy. He demanded all power to the Soviets, arguing that the provisional government had no legitimacy and that only the councils of workers and soldiers represented the people. He promised land to the peasants, taken from landlords, without compensation. He insisted that Russia could move directly to socialism, bypassing the gradual stages that many Marxists believed necessary. The effect was electric. To moderates, Lenin's ideas seemed reckless, even dangerous. To his opponents, they were madness. But to soldiers weary of fighting, to workers tired of waiting in bread lines, to peasants longing for land, his words resonated. He had taken their everyday struggles and turned them into a program of action. In factories, Bolshevik pamphlets carried the slogans from the April Theses: peace, bread, land. They were simple, direct, and easy to remember. In barracks, soldiers debated his call to end the war. Some officers denounced him as a traitor, but among the rank and file, his words spread quickly. In villages, peasants heard whispers of land redistribution, promises that the estates of landlords would soon be theirs. The April Theses also exposed divisions within the revolutionary movement. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, more moderate factions, believed Lenin was pushing too fast, too far. They still hoped to work with the provisional government until elections could be held. They argued that Russia needed stability before socialism could be attempted. Lenin dismissed such caution as betrayal. For him, the moment was now, and hesitation was fatal. Lenin's return also changed the internal dynamics of the Bolshevik Party. Before April, many Bolshevik leaders in Petrograd had been cautious, considering cooperation with other socialist groups. Lenin swept that aside. His authority, sharpened by years of exile and his sheer force of conviction, redirected the party onto a path of confrontation. From April onward, the Bolsheviks no longer spoke of compromise, but of power. Ordinary people did not read every word of the April Theses, nor did they study Lenin's writings in detail. What they heard were the essentials: peace from war, bread for the hungry, land for the peasants, power to the Soviets. These promises spoke directly to lives defined by deprivation. A soldier returning from the front wanted peace more than democracy. A worker waiting in a bread line wanted food more than speeches. A peasant plowing thin soil wanted land more than constitutions. Lenin had distilled their frustrations into a vision that felt tangible. The April Theses did not immediately bring power to the Bolsheviks. Through the spring and summer, they remained a minority among the Soviets, often challenged by moderates. But the seeds were planted. Each time the provisional government failed to deliver bread, or persisted with the war, or delayed land reform, Lenin's vision gained credibility. Each disappointment was proof of his argument that only a new order could solve Russia's crisis. For many in Russia, Lenin's arrival was a turning point, the moment when the revolution acquired direction. However radical, he had returned not with weapons or wealth, but with ideas. And those ideas spread quickly, carried in pamphlets, speeches, and rumors whispered in bread lines and barracks. But if Lenin's April Theses offered answers, they also raised questions. Could Russia, exhausted and divided, leap directly into socialism? Could Soviets, born of chaos, truly govern an empire? Could peace, bread, and land be delivered in practice? Or were they destined to remain slogans? The answers were not yet clear in April 1917. What was clear was that the revolution had found its most forceful voice. That voice was demanding change without delay. The arrival of Lenin in Petrograd and the unveiling of his April Theses did not immediately turn Russia red. Instead, it plunged the revolutionary movement into fierce debates in factories, in barracks, in the Soviets, and even within the Bolshevik Party itself. For months, his radical proposals hovered over every discussion, shaping arguments, dividing allies, and slowly tilting the balance of power. The first audience for Lenin's theses was not the workers or soldiers of Petrograd, but his own comrades. Many Bolsheviks were unsettled. They had expected him to advocate cooperation with other socialist factions, to work gradually toward influence within the provisional government. Instead, he denounced the government outright, calling it a tool of imperialism and demanding its immediate overthrow. Some party members whispered that Lenin had been out of Russia too long, that his isolation in Switzerland had made him detached from reality. Others feared his extremism would alienate potential allies, but Lenin's conviction was unshakable. He argued not from emotion, but from cold logic. The provisional government, he insisted, had no legitimacy because it represented the bourgeoisie, landowners, industrialists, and liberals, rather than workers and peasants. To cooperate with it was to betray the revolution. Only Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, could express the true will of the people. At first, Lenin was in the minority. In April and May, the Petrograd Soviet remained dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. They believed the revolution had to pass through a bourgeois democratic stage before socialism could be attempted. This was classic Marxist theory. First capitalism, then socialism. Lenin dismissed this progression as unnecessary. Russia, he said, could leap directly into socialism because the Soviets already embodied workers' power. To many, this was heresy. To others, it was revelation. Outside political circles, the reception was different. Workers and soldiers did not debate Marxist theory. They judged ideas by their simplicity and relevance. Peace, bread, land, the slogan drawn from Lenin's theses, was clear. For soldiers still in the trenches, it meant an end to slaughter. For workers in Petrograd, it meant food for their families. For peasants, it meant fields of their own, compared to the provisional government's vague promises of future reform. Lenin's program felt immediate. Meetings of the Soviets became battlegrounds for these ideas. Delegates shouted across smoky halls, waving pamphlets and denouncing each other. Mensheviks urged patience, arguing that Russia needed time to stabilize. Bolsheviks, emboldened by Lenin, demanded action. Votes swung back and forth, sometimes narrowly favoring moderates, sometimes shifting toward radicals. For ordinary workers attending, the spectacle was exhilarating. For the first time, their voices mattered in determining the future of the nation. The April theses also stirred anxiety in the provisional government. Leaders like Kerensky viewed Lenin as a dangerous agitator, undermining discipline in the army and stirring unrest in factories. Newspapers sympathetic to the government accused him of being a German agent, smuggled into Russia to weaken it from within. The accusation stuck in some circles, and whispers spread in bread lines and barracks. Was Lenin working for the enemy? But for many, the suspicion did not outweigh the appeal of his promises. If the German agent called for peace, while the Russian government sent them to die, who was truly betraying the people? Through May and June, the debates intensified. Strikes continued in Petrograd. Soldiers at the front wrote letters home describing shortages and mutinies. Peasants seized land in the countryside, often invoking Lenin slogans as justification. Each act of disobedience made the provisional government weaker, and each failure to restore order made Lenin's words seem prophetic. The Bolsheviks began to grow in number. Meetings that once attracted a handful of supporters now filled large halls. Factory committees elected Bolshevik delegates more frequently. Soldiers in garrisons, frustrated with the government's insistence on continuing the war, turned to the Bolsheviks' call for peace. What had been a radical minority was slowly becoming a mass movement. The June offensive, launched by the provisional government to revive the war effort, was a disaster. Soldiers refused to advance, morale collapsed, and casualties mounted. News of the offensive's failure spread rapidly, reinforcing Lenin's argument that only immediate peace could save Russia. In factories and barracks, workers and soldiers muttered. He was right. Still, divisions persisted. Even among Bolsheviks, some worried that Lenin was pushing too quickly. Could they truly seize power? Were the Soviets ready to govern? Lenin brushed aside these concerns. For him, hesitation was fatal. History was moving rapidly. Only those willing to act decisively could shape it. The July days' uprising revealed both the strength and weakness of Lenin's influence. In Petrograd, workers and soldiers poured into the streets, demanding all power to the Soviets. The demonstrations were massive, fueled by hunger, anger, and war weariness. Though the Bolsheviks had not organized the uprising, they were associated with it. The provisional government responded with force, dispersing crowds, arresting leaders, and branding the Bolsheviks as traitors. Lenin went into hiding. For a moment, it seemed as though his vision had faltered, but repression could not erase the hunger or end the war. By August, when Kornilov attempted his march on Petrograd, the provisional government was forced to rely on the Soviets and even the Bolsheviks to defend the city. Once again, Lenin's thesis that the government was powerless without the Soviets was proven correct. The Kornilov affair destroyed what little trust remained in the provisional government and gave the Bolsheviks another surge of credibility. By September, the Bolsheviks held majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, teased what had seemed reckless. In April was now reality. Lenin's vision was becoming the dominant voice of the revolution. The April theses, once dismissed as extreme, had reshaped the political landscape. By the end of the summer of 1917, Lenin's April theses were no longer just radical words on paper. They had become the guiding force behind a movement that was gathering momentum with each failure of the provisional government. What began in April as a minority position, ridiculed by moderates and doubted even by comrades, had by September become a plausible roadmap to power. The months between spring and autumn were a slow, grinding test of patience, propaganda, and politics, and they carried Russia closer to revolution. When Lenin had unveiled the April theses, he had insisted that the provisional government was doomed. At the time, many dismissed this as exaggeration. By September, it seemed like prophecy. The government had promised bread, but delivered queues. It had promised peace, but delivered more war. It had promised land reform, but delayed endlessly. Each broken promise turned more people toward the Soviets, and, increasingly, toward the Bolsheviks, who called for the Soviets to take full control. Inside the Bolshevik Party, Lenin pushed relentlessly. From hiding, he wrote letters urging decisive action. History will not forgive us if we do not seize power now, he warned. He believed that delay meant disaster, that hesitation would allow reactionary forces to regroup or foreign armies to intervene. The Soviets already leaned toward Bolshevik leadership. To him, the moment was ripe, but not all Bolsheviks agreed. Figures like Kamenev and Zinoviev urged caution. They feared that the party was not ready, that the uprising might fail, that Russia might descend into chaos even worse than before. Their doubts reflected a real concern. While Petrograd and Moscow were increasingly radical, much of the countryside was still unpredictable. Could a government born from Soviets truly hold together a vast empire? Lenin dismissed these doubts as weakness. For him, revolution was never neat or guaranteed. It was a matter of timing, striking when the old order was weakest and the new order strongest. By autumn, he believed That moment had arrived. The Soviets themselves were transforming. In April and May, they had been dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who urged cooperation with the provisional government. By September, Bolsheviks held the majority in Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Resolutions calling for all power to the Soviets passed with thunderous applause. In factories, workers raised their hands for Bolshevik delegates. In barracks, soldiers cheered speeches denouncing the war. The Soviets were shifting from debating chambers to instruments of revolutionary authority. The Kornilov affair in August had accelerated this shift. General Kornilov's attempt to march on Petrograd had terrified many, raising fears of a military dictatorship. To defend the city, Kerensky turned to the Soviets, arming workers and relying on Bolshevik-led Red Guards. The coup collapsed, but its political effect was decisive. The provisional government was seen as helpless. While the Soviets emerged as defenders of the revolution, Bolsheviks, once branded as traitors in July, now appeared as saviors in September. For ordinary Russians, Lenin's theses had become more than theory. In breadlines, people repeated the slogans. In the trenches, soldiers muttered about peace. In villages, peasants invoked the promise of land redistribution as justification for seizing estates. The language of the April theses had escaped pamphlets and entered daily speech. It was no longer about Marxist doctrine, it was about survival. By October, the tension was palpable. Petrograd simmered with expectation. Workers whispered of an impending uprising. Soldiers debated whether to obey orders from officers or committees. The provisional government still issued decrees, but few listened. Authority had shifted to the Soviets in practice, if not yet in name. Lenin, still in hiding, pressed for action. From his safe house, he sent urgent letters demanding that the Bolsheviks prepare to seize power. Delay is death, he wrote. He argued that the Soviets already had legitimacy, that they must now take responsibility. Every day of hesitation, he warned, increased the risk of counter-revolution. The Bolshevik Central Committee was divided, but Lenin's persistence wore down resistance. Trotsky, who had joined the Bolsheviks earlier in 1917, became a crucial ally. As chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky organized a military revolutionary committee, ostensibly to defend the city. In reality, it became the command structure for an uprising. Red Guards drilled openly, soldiers pledged loyalty, were queued. When the moment came in late October, the Bolsheviks acted in the name of the Soviets. This was Lenin's great strategic insight, to present the seizure of power not as a party coup, but as the Soviets assuming their rightful authority. It gave the revolution legitimacy in the eyes of workers and soldiers who already trusted their councils. The takeover itself was swift. Railway stations, telegraph lines, and bridges were seized with little resistance. The Winter Palace, defended by a small force of cadets and Cossacks, fell after brief fighting. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested. By morning, Petrograd was in Bolshevik hands at the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin appeared before the delegates. His words were stark. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. That declaration, the April theses, once dismissed as unrealistic, became the foundation of a new government. The promises of peace, bread, and land were not immediately fulfilled. Negotiations with Germany dragged on, hunger persisted, and land seizures unfolded chaotically, but the direction was set. The Soviets, under Bolshevik leadership, had become the state. Lenin's vision had moved from thesis to practice, from pamphlet to power. The April theses mattered not only for their content, but for their clarity. In a time of confusion, they offered simple answers. While others spoke of compromise, Lenin spoke of action. While others promised reforms in the future, Lenin promised survival in the present. His words cut through the fog of 1917, giving the revolution a direction it had lacked, and yet the questions remained. Could the Soviets truly govern an empire fractured by war, famine, and rebellion? Could the Bolsheviks deliver peace, bread, and land? Or would these remain elusive promises? The October Revolution marked a beginning, not an end. The April theses had set the course, but where that course would ultimately lead was still uncertain. By late October 1917, Petrograd was a city of waiting. Its streets were crowded but restless, its factories noisy but uncertain, its barracks filled with soldiers who no longer trusted their officers. Hunger lingered in bread lines, whispers spread in tramcars, and the air itself seemed to carry a sense of expectation. People did not know exactly what was coming, but they knew something was. The provisional government was still in place, but its power was paper thin. The Soviets, dominated now by the Bolsheviks, spoke with growing authority. Russia stood on the edge of another revolution, and Petrograd was the stage upon which it would begin. The city itself revealed the tension. By day, workers trudged to factories, though strikes and walkouts were increasingly common. By night, Red Guards, armed workers organized through the Soviets, drilled in courtyards and warehouses. Barricades of timber and cobblestone appeared in some neighborhoods, then disappeared again, built not out of immediate necessity, but as practice, as anticipation. Posters clung to walls, some urging loyalty to the provisional government, others proclaiming all power to the Soviets. Arguments flared in the streets. Which side would prevail? Which side deserved to rule? The provisional government, under Alexander Kerensky, tried to project confidence. Ministers gave speeches promising stability, order, and progress. They spoke of upcoming elections for a constituent assembly, which would establish a legitimate democracy. But their words rang hollow. Each day brought more shortages, more strikes, more desertions from the front. Soldiers who had once saluted. Officers now turned their backs. Workers who had once jeered reforms now jeered promises. The provisional government still issued decrees, but in practice controlled little beyond the Winter Palace and a few offices. The Soviets, by contrast, commanded loyalty where it mattered most. In factories, workers elected Bolshevik delegates who demanded immediate action: bread, peace, and land. In barracks, soldiers trusted their committees more than their commanders. In neighborhoods, Red Guards patrolled, gaining a reputation as defenders of the people. To many, the Soviets were not an abstract ideal, but the authority closest to their lives. Trotsky, as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, played a central role in this shift. A skilled orator and strategist, he organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, ostensibly to protect the city from counter-revolutionary threats. In reality, it became the Bolsheviks' command center. Units loyal to the committee were placed at key positions: bridges, telegraph offices, railway stations. Slowly, without fanfare, the infrastructure of Petrograd slipped into Soviet hands. For ordinary citizens, life continued in uneasy normality. Trams still ran, though less reliably. Shops opened, though shelves were bare. Families still gathered in communal kitchens, stretching meager rations. Yet, beneath the routines lay fear and anticipation. People spoke in whispers about what might happen. Would there be bloodshed? Would the city erupt in violence? Would the waiting itself be endless? As October deepened, the government's weakness became impossible to hide. Kerensky tried to rally support by denouncing the Bolsheviks as traitors, accusing them of plotting to deliver Russia into German hands. Newspapers carried warnings of impending chaos if the Soviets seized power. But these appeals no longer persuaded. Soldiers at the front, already weary, of war, wondered why they should fight for a government that could not even feed their families. Workers in factories wondered why they should obey managers when the Soviets spoke more directly to their needs. The more Kerensky warned, the more people turned away. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, prepared carefully. Lenin, still in hiding earlier that autumn, pressed his comrades to act quickly. Delay, he argued, was fatal. History will not forgive us if we do not seize power now. His urgency was rooted in fear that the provisional government might regroup, that elections might diminish Bolshevik influence, that counter-revolutionary forces might seize the moment. Trotsky and the Military Revolutionary Committee translated this urgency into organization, drilling Red Guards and securing arsenals. On the eve of the uprising, Petrograd was tense but quiet. Rumors filled the city. Some said Kerensky had ordered loyal troops to crush the Soviets. Others whispered that the Bolsheviks would rise that very night. Families locked doors early, listening for distant gunfire. In the Winter Palace, ministers debated their options, but their words could not change the reality that power was slipping away. When the Bolsheviks finally moved, it was not with chaos, but with precision. Units loyal to the Soviets took control of key points with little resistance. Railway stations were occupied, telegraph offices seized, bridges secured. The cruiser Aurora, anchored on the Neva, loomed as a symbol of Bolshevik strength, its crew sympathetic to the revolution. The provisional government, isolated in the Winter Palace, was surrounded without realizing how thoroughly its authority had already evaporated for Petrograd's residents. The revolution unfolded almost quietly. Trams ran the next morning, bread lines formed as usual, children played in courtyards. The great event that would later be dramatized in films and paintings was, at the time, a series of small, decisive moves carried out in the shadows. The noise of speeches and rumors was louder than the sound of actual fighting, but beneath the quiet, the nation was being remade. The October Revolution was not only a change of government. Key was the transfer of legitimacy from ministers and palaces to Soviets in factories and barracks. Power was no longer a distant promise of elections. It was immediate, embodied in councils of workers and soldiers. Still, the future was uncertain. The Bolsheviks promised peace, bread, and land, but promises alone would not fill shelves or stop hunger. The provisional government had failed to deliver. Could the Soviets do better? Come. The October Revolution ended one chapter, but it opened a new one filled with questions. For the people waiting in Petrograd's bread lines, the city in darkness felt like the beginning of something, though no one yet knew whether that something would bring relief or more hardship. Asterisk. The October Revolution has often been remembered as a dramatic storming of palaces, a night of barricades and battles in the streets. Films and paintings later turned it into an epic spectacle, filled with explosions, charging crowds, and banners in the night. But in Petrograd itself, the reality was quieter, more deliberate, and, in some ways, more unsettling. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a careful dismantling of the provisional government's authority, carried out step by step, in a city that barely stirred. On the morning of October 24th, Petrograd was restless but calm. Trams rattled along their tracks, bakeries opened, and bread lines formed as usual. Workers in factories whispered rumors. The Bolsheviks were preparing to act. The government was planning a crackdown. The city was on the verge of something. Soldiers in garrisons debated orders, but increasingly looked to their committees instead of officers. The provisional government still sat in the Winter Palace, but its isolation was obvious. The Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet had been preparing for days. Trotsky, its leader, was meticulous. He understood that the revolution would succeed, not by spectacular clashes, but by control of key points. If railway stations, telegraphs, bridges, and arsenals were secured, the government would be cut off, unable to act. And so, orders went out quietly to loyal units and Red Guards. By evening, Red Guards began to move. Small groups of armed workers walked through the streets, sometimes disguised as ordinary civilians, sometimes openly carrying rifles. Their targets were practical: the central post office, the telephone exchange, the telegraph station, the railway terminals. At each site, they confronted small groups of guards, most of whom offered little or no resistance. Many soldiers were already sympathetic to the Soviets. Some even welcomed the takeover, relieved to be spared the responsibility of defending a government they no longer believed in. The bridges across the Neva River were key. Whoever controlled them controlled the city's movement. Red Guards and soldiers seized them during the night, raising red flags over the spans. Streetcars passed by, their passengers watching quietly as armed men took positions. Some commuters shrugged, others whispered anxiously. Yet few intervened. The revolution advanced not through masses in the streets, but through the quiet resignation of a city that no longer trusted its government. The cruiser Aurora, anchored in the river, became a symbol of the uprising. Its crew, long radicalized, sided with the Bolsheviks. On the evening of October 25th, its guns trained on the Winter Palace. SIP fired a blank shell, not an attack, but a signal. That single boom, echoing across Petrograd, became the moment remembered as the beginning of the revolution. In truth, by then, most of the city was already in Soviet hands. Inside the Winter Palace, ministers of the provisional government huddled in fear and uncertainty. Kerensky, the head of government, had already fled in search of reinforcements. What remained were weary officials, a small force of cadets and Cossacks, and a few women's battalions. They were brave, but hopelessly outnumbered. Red Guards encircled the palace. The defenders debated whether to resist or surrender. Some argued for holding out until loyal troops arrived. Others knew none were coming. The storming of the palace, later immortalized in Soviet films as a dramatic clash, was in reality slow and anticlimactic. Red Guards and soldiers entered cautiously, moving through darkened corridors and staircases. There was confusion more than combat. Shots were fired sporadically, but little blood was spilled. By early morning, the palace was fully occupied, and the ministers were under arrest. The provisional government had fallen with scarcely a fight. What is striking about the October Revolution is how ordinary it felt to many in Petrograd. Workers still went to factories during those days, though production was erratic. Bread lines still formed. Families huddled in apartments, listening for sounds of battle that never came. The storming was less like a battle and more like the collapse of a house already rotted at the foundation. The provisional government did not fall because it was overthrown with overwhelming force. It fell because no one was willing to defend it. Yet the symbolism mattered. The blank shot from the Aurora, the seizure of the Winter Palace, the red flags raised on bridges. These images became the revolution's mythology. They gave drama to what had been a quiet dismantling, transforming it into a story of heroic struggle. For those who lived through it, however, the memory was often one of silence, confusion, and the unsettling realization that power had shifted while the city barely noticed. Once the ministers were arrested, the Bolsheviks wasted no time. At the Smolny Institute, headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet, Lenin appeared before delegates and announced the birth of Soviet power. His words were plain but momentous. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. The apotheses, once dismissed as fantasy, were now the foundation of government. The decrees that followed were immediate and sweeping. One ended Russia's participation in the war, calling for peace negotiations. Another redistributed land to the peasants, legalizing what they had already begun seizing. A third gave workers control of factories, recognizing the committees they had formed for soldiers, workers, and peasants. These decrees seemed to promise that the revolution would deliver not just words, but tangible change. But questions loomed. Could the new Soviet government actually implement these decrees? Could it feed the cities, stabilize the economy, and manage peace with Germany? Could Soviets govern a vast, divided empire, or would power centralize in the hands of the Bolsheviks alone? For the moment, those questions were deferred. What mattered was that power had shifted. The Winter Palace was no longer the seat of government. The Soviets, led by the Bolsheviks, now ruled Russia for Petrograd's residents. The days after the revolution felt both ordinary and strange. Trams still clattered, queues still stretched before bakeries, factories still struggled with shortages, but the sense of authority had changed. Ministers in suits were gone. Delegates in workers' caps spoke in their place. A new order had been declared, though its shape was still uncertain. The morning after the October Revolution, Petrograd awoke to a strange calm. The great event that would later be immortalized in murals, parades, and films had passed almost quietly. There had been no mass uprising, no citywide battle, no thunder of artillery. Instead, power had shifted in silence, carried on the footsteps of Red Guards and whispered orders of Soviet committees. Too many residents, it felt almost anticlimactic. The trams still clattered down Nevsky Prospect, bread lines still wound through the streets, and workers still trudged to factories. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, everything had changed. The provisional government was gone. Its ministers, taken from the Winter Palace in the early hours, now sat in cells. Kerensky, its prime minister, had fled into obscurity. The institutions of liberal democracy, already fragile, had collapsed overnight. In their place stood the Soviets' councils of workers, soldiers, peasants, now dominated by the Bolsheviks. At the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet, the new rulers wasted no time. Lenin, emerging from secrecy, addressed the assembled delegates. His words were short but emphatic. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. The Bolsheviks presented themselves not as usurpers, but as the executors of the Soviets' will, the fulfillment of what had already been happening in factories, barracks, villages. The first decrees of the new government were bold and direct. The decree on peace called for an immediate end to the war, urging soldiers to cease hostilities and governments to negotiate. It was a breathtaking move. Russia was still officially at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but Lenin insisted that the slaughter had to stop. To the weary soldiers in the trenches, it was the most important promise they had ever heard. To generals and foreign allies, it was betrayal. The decree on land legalized what peasants had already begun. For months, villages across Russia had seized estates, dividing fields, burning barns, and plowing land as their own. The new government simply confirmed this reality. Land would no longer belong to landlords, but to those who worked it. For peasants, it was liberation. For landowners, it was dispossession. Another decree granted workers control of factories. Committees that had already challenged managers were now recognized as legitimate authorities. Wages, hours, and production would be determined not by owners, but by workers themselves. It was an unprecedented transfer of power, born of revolution and necessity. For ordinary people, these decrees mattered less as laws and more as promises. Soldiers at the front heard of peace and hoped it meant they could finally go home. Workers in Petrograd read of factory control and hoped it meant food and fairness. Peasants in distant villages heard of land reform and hoped it meant security. Whether or not the decrees could be enforced was uncertain. What mattered was that the new government seemed to speak their language. Still, confusion abounded. Not everyone accepted Bolshevik authority. Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries denounced the seizure of power as illegitimate, warning that it would lead to dictatorship. Some Soviets outside Petrograd resisted Bolshevik influence, preferring to remain independent. In the army, some officers still urged discipline and loyalty to the old command. In the countryside, peasants were often less interested in decrees than in seizing what they needed. Foreign powers watched with alarm. Britain, France, and the United States, allies in the war, saw Russia's withdrawal as a disaster. Germany, meanwhile, welcomed the chaos, hoping it would free their armies on the Eastern Front. Russia, already exhausted, was now isolated, its new government surrounded by suspicion for Petrograd's residents. The days after the revolution felt both ordinary and surreal. Life did not suddenly improve. Bread was still scarce, coal still short, streets still crowded with weary faces. Yet there was a sense of newness, of uncertainty. People spoke of the power of the Soviets with curiosity, as though testing the words. Boasters proclaimed the decrees. Red flags fluttered from buildings, and the Smolny Institute buzzed with activity. Still, the city was cold, hungry, and anxious. The Bolsheviks themselves faced daunting tasks. They had seized power, but could they hold it? Could Soviets, designed for debate and representation, govern an empire of 150 million people? Could decrees become reality in a land of collapsing railways, hostile generals, and famine? The answers were unclear. What was clear was that the revolution had shifted legitimacy. For centuries, Russia's people had been subjects of a czar. For months, they had been governed by ministers in suits. Now, power belonged, at least in theory, to councils of workers and peasants. Whether or not those councils could truly command an empire, their authority felt closer, more immediate, than anything that had come before. The October Revolution was both dramatic and understated. It toppled the government, yet many residents barely noticed. It promised sweeping change, yet daily life continued in familiar hardship. It created a new state, yet left unanswered whether that state could survive. And so, in the quiet days after October 25th, Petrograd stood at the threshold of a new era. The Soviets ruled in name, the Bolsheviks guided in practice, and the people waited in breadlines, in barracks, villages, to see if the promises of peace, bread, men, and land would become reality. Would the new government succeed where the old had failed? Or had Russia merely exchanged one fragile authority for another? The October Revolution had given the Bolsheviks power in Petrograd, but taking a city was not the same as holding an empire. In the weeks after the Winter Palace fell, it became clear that the revolution was not yet over. Across Russia, opponents of Bolshevik rule began to gather. Monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, landowners. Foreign powers all saw in Lenin's new government not a new beginning, but a threat. For the Bolsheviks, the true test of survival would come not in speeches at the Smolny Institute, but in the fields, forests, and railways of a fractured nation. What followed was not a single battle or a quick campaign, but years of civil war, fought across vast distances under brutal conditions, and at the cost of millions of lives. The Bolsheviks called themselves the Reds, a name drawn from the color of revolution. Their enemies became known as the Whites, a loose coalition united less by a common vision than by opposition to Bolshevik rule. The Whites included generals of the old Tsarist army who dreamed of restoring order, liberals who longed for a parliamentary democracy, and foreign troops sent by allies hoping to drag Russia back into the war. The Civil War was not only a conflict of armies, but a clash of ideologies, regions, and survival strategies. The geography of Russia shaped the war from the beginning. The Reds held the core, Petrograd, Moscow, and much of central Russia. This gave them control of industry, railways, and the densest populations. The Whites, scattered across the peripheries in Siberia, the south, to the northwest, had space and resources, but little coordination. To strike effectively, they needed unity, but unity was elusive. Each white leader pursued his own goals, often clashing with others. For the Bolsheviks, survival depended on discipline. Trotsky, appointed Commissar of War, transformed the Red Army from a loose force of volunteers into a disciplined military. He reintroduced strict hierarchies, conscription, and even employed former Tsarist officers under close Bolshevik supervision. His methods were harsh, but effective. Trains became his headquarters. He traveled constantly, inspecting troops, delivering fiery speeches, and enforcing discipline. To desert was to risk execution, but to follow meant food, shelter, and purpose in a collapsing world. For ordinary people, the Civil War was less about ideology than survival. Villages were requisitioned for grain by whichever army passed through. A red detachment might demand food one week. A white force might arrive the next and demand the same. Resistance often meant violence, as families learned to hide grain in pits, to send livestock into forests, to pretend poverty when soldiers arrived. Hunger became universal. Epidemics of typhus and influenza spread through weakened communities, killing more than bullets. In the cities, shortages deepened. Petrograd, once the empire's capital, shrank as residents fled hunger and cold. Factories closed, electricity flickered, fuel vanished. People tore up wooden fences and furniture for firewood. Moscow, though more stable, faced the same struggles. The revolution had promised bread and peace, but civil war brought hunger and fear. The whites at first seemed to have the advantage. They received supplies from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. Their armies, though scattered, were led by experienced generals like Denikin in the south, Kolchak in Siberia, and Yudenik in the northwest. At times, they advanced dangerously close to Moscow and Petrograd. In 1919, it seemed possible the Bolsheviks might collapse. Yet the whites faltered. They lacked unity, often fighting each other as much as the Reds. Their vision for Russia's future was unclear. Some wanted a return to monarchy, others a republic. Some promised land reform, others threatened to restore estates. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of Russia's population, the whites seemed like a return to the old order. Many peasants, reluctantly or pragmatically, sided with the Reds, who at least promised land, even if grain requisitions were harsh.